Welcome to another episode. This is an installation video for the IS300. We got a bunch of stuff from Serial 9, which is supposed to be some really good quality stuff for this car. Today we're going to be doing the subframe bushings and diff bushings, which I have right here. These seem really well made. I've done quite a few different subframe bushings, and these are pretty hefty. Came pretty nice in the box. Got these from Drift HQ. I will put a link in the description to them if you are interested. This is not sponsored, not plugged or anything like that. I paid full price for these. Let's see. Diff bushings, solid bushings. Seem pretty self-explanatory. I definitely recommend doing both of these kits at the same time. You're going to have it all out. If you don't have a welded diff, weld your diff at the same time. It's just way easier to do it all at once than to have to pull the subframe twice or just pull your axle bolts out twice or whatever. So if you only have one kit, go buy the other one first. I've pulled quite a few diffs out of IS300s, and they are by far one of the biggest pains in the butt to get out, mostly because everything rusts under here very quickly, especially with these older cars, and the axle bolts in here tend to seize up no matter how much torque you put on there, and they're Allen key bolts, so they just strip out immediately. So we're probably going to have to cut these off and replace them with different bolts, or I'll just drop the entire thing together and leave it all as one piece, which is a possibility as well. But I also did want to weld this diff at the same time, so that might be a little hard to do with everything intact. We'll give it a try and we'll see how it goes. I'm also going to be installing the Serial 9 dual caliper kit with Wilwood brakes, also from Drift HQ. Click here if you want to see that video. If you like drifting content, make sure you check out my other videos and subscribe. I do a lot of videos on the skyline behind me. Haven't really driven the IS300 for drifting yet, just because we've been setting it up since I bought it, but a lot of footage of that Vet, which is caged with an LS2. Very awesome car, one of my favorites to drive, so make sure to subscribe and check out all the other content. Full disclaimer, this is a pretty big job to do. It's a fair amount of work. You don't need any like specialty tools or anything like that, but as I said before, bolts get seized and everything, so you're gonna need some high torque impacts and probably some PB blaster, which reminds me, I think I have some around here somewhere. I'll find it. But once you take the wheels off, you're gonna probably want to start disconnecting things. I'm gonna do things a little different because I'm going to kind of just drop everything together, so I'll probably just disconnect the coilovers and the brakes and drop the whole subframe as a unit, since I'm getting in there anyways.
Alright, so the first thing we have to do is disconnect the coilovers from the lower control arms. And after that, you can disconnect the exhaust as well. You might have a different setup than I do. I had a bunch of weird welds in this setup, just from deleting the cap. So you might have a test pipe or some more welds or some less welds or something. So just undo everything that's underneath the subframe. If you have to go further along, then disconnect it further along. search around for a zip tie to actually secure the exhaust that was hanging down from there. Spraying a little WD-40 on the hangers helps a lot. Usually there's a lot of rust and weathering and they're really hard to get off. Just add a little lubrication and they'll slide right out. You'll want to remove these two bars that are going underneath the axles. They're in the way, so you'll need 12 or 14 millimeter to take those off. Pretty easy. Mine were seized up, so the bolt heads broke. And then went ahead and removed the plastic pieces that are protecting the drive shaft as well. And then we're just going to clean up everything with a little bit of PB Blast. There's a lot of rust under here, surface rust, so that'll help those bolts come loose quicker. Then we're going to take off our brake calipers, just 2 bolts behind the brakes, and then you want to zip tie them up so that they're not hanging by the lines, because that can damage the lines, and we don't want to have to re-bleed the pressure from the brakes anyways. Here I was testing the bolts where the axles are just to see if they would come loose, and they were very well stuck on there, seized up. I was also seeing the drain plug for the diff to see if that would come open, and the same thing, it's just really seized up. I didn't want to apply too much pressure and strip it out, because that was an Allen key bolt as well. So then I moved on to the drive shaft. This one gave me a bit of a hard time. First 3 bolts came off pretty easily, and then the last one would not move with the impact, so I had to apply a bit of torque on there with the right socket. So if yours gives you issues, just be patient with it. Use as much torque as you can. Don't just sit there with an impact like I was at first. Just wouldn't budge. Some PB Blaster again will help you. But you'll just want to get like a long rod from your jack, or if you have a torque wrench or something that can loosen, then that works great. So here I remove the ABS sensors. It's just one 10mm bolt on the top of the V knuckle on the rear. So you'll want to disconnect that so you don't have any wires pulling when you drop the subframe.
Alright, so make sure you remove all the supports that are in the way. Usually they are 12 or 14mm bolts. You can either throw them away like I'm doing, or save them and put them back on if you want the protection of not having dust and tire everywhere. So you'll have to remove the boots that are covering your subframe bolts. Make sure you remove the drive shaft. Mine was a bit of a pain in the ass. Disconnect that. Basically you're getting everything free until you have to actually drop the subframe bolts. The hardest part probably is going to be doing the factory e-brake lines if you have the factory e-brake. Those are hard lines that run all the way across the trans tunnel here and into your knuckle. We are going to be removing our drum brake from our factory e-brake because we're going to be installing that dual caliber kit, so that's going to be in the way. If you decide you want to keep yours, then it'll honestly be a lot more work to try and keep it, because you're going to have to remove that line to drop the subframe from the front of the car, and I'll show you how. We're not going to do it this way, but I'm going to cover it just in case you want to approach that method. Basically, your drive shaft splits into two pieces here, and you have this cable way up here. So this is what actually connects to the handle inside the car, and then you can see it connects to two sides here, and there's a line. What you'll have to do is you'll have to pull this down and spin this line to the side, and then there's actually a hole up top that you can slide this little pivot piece through, and that disconnects it from that end as opposed to disconnecting it from your knuckle. So once you disconnect it from that end, then you can run these lines, you know, undo all these bolts and run the line through here so that the subframe drops with this line free and connected to the knuckle, as opposed to dropping the way I'm going to do it and disconnecting it from the whole hub assembly itself and leaving the line hanging on this end like that. I've already done that side, so I'm going to show you how to do this side.
So you really don't need to completely disassemble your stock handbrake assembly if you are not doing the dual caliber kit like I'm doing. You'll see here I'm undoing the lines from the factory handbrake from the knuckle all the way back and taking the lines out completely. If you're keeping your factory handbrake, you can just leave them on the knuckle and disconnect them from the cabin.
We've got everything that we need to pull out. Everything is free other than the four screws holding in the subframe. Everything else is disconnected, so there won't be anything to stop us in the way. Now, I highly recommend doing this with at least two people because the diff alone needs two people. It's very heavy, especially with the fluid in it, but also because the subframe is very heavy as well. I'm using a teardown table, so I'm actually just going to use the lift to drop the car onto the teardown table. I'm going to actually use a jack on top of the teardown table because you can't really undo the bolts with the subframe sitting on the table. So I'll stick a jack to the bottom of the diff, undo the bolts, and then I will slowly let the jack down and let the subframe out of the bottom of the car because I am doing this alone. So again, I don't recommend doing this alone, especially if you are under jack stands under your car. It's a lot of weight. Weight can shift off of the jack stands, off of the jack. Definitely have at least one person with you when you're doing this.
This part can be tricky with positioning everything properly. Getting the jack right under the diff is usually the best option because it's pretty centered in terms of weight. But if you have a flatter surface or if your car is just on jack stands, then it won't make much of a difference if you just put the jack right under the diff and just drop it to the floor. There were a few additional bolts here that I had missed. I skipped over them because they were pretty well shredded, as you'll see. Had to just kind of bend that piece out of the way because those bolts would not come done at all. And you'll see why here in a few minutes. finally do get everything loose and unbolted, it will take quite a bit of maneuvering to get everything to drop the way you want it to exactly. There's 4 really heavy duty points where this subframe mounts in, so you'll need to make sure that they are coming down evenly.
As you can see, I had some issues there. I had a clip here that was holding an electrical wire that I'd already unplugged, but it was still holding onto the subframe. We had this side would not come off, so it was probably just seized up in here on that, or what usually happens is you have one side that comes out first, and that like puts so much tension on here that the tension alone holds the side on. So what I did was I tried to maneuver the jack and lift the front side up so that this piece could get straightened and fall out of place, and then I could just release the jack and the whole thing fell evenly after that point. I also had these extra mounts that would not come off. It looks like the previous owner had it slammed so much that he grinded these bolts down. I successfully got one bolt out with an extractor, but could not get any surface on the other ones. You can see this one's like, it folded in on itself, and basically there's no way for me to get around it. This is the one I extracted. Same up here. So now I can get to work on the bushings. Trick to these is lots of BB blaster, and then we're going to torch the rubber out and then take a Sawzall and cut the, whatever you call them, the little fittings in there so that we can fit the solid ones in. Same with the subframe bushings. So yeah, that should be fun. Alright, this is a size 12 millimeter, which fits perfectly in there. These are very in there, so I'm gonna put some torque on it because the impact isn't doing it. Like that. And these bolts are still really good, so these are solid. So I just tilted that forward. It gives me enough room to get under here to these subframe bushings, and then that should free the diff from the subframe. So I'm not going to take the axles out of the diff, and I'll tell you why. I've taken 3 of these apart, and I've done a lot of research and read forums and other people who have the same issue. These bolts are seized. They will not come off with an Allen bolt, with an impact or anything. Usually the impact doesn't even fit in here without killing this boot anyways. I really don't feel like cutting it. It takes forever. Cutting 6 bolts on each side, 12 bolts, then replacing them for, you know, $30 something, and then having to put those in and torque them down with an Allen key. It's not worth it. I'd much rather do this. Since we're dropping the subframe anyways, I'd much rather disconnect the lower control arm, which it's not aligned anyways. I need to get it aligned. I had to drop the subframe for the bushings anyways, so might as well just do it this way. So 1 big bolt here, 1 big bolt there. Now my knuckle can move enough that I can actually slip this axle out of the spline there. Now once I take the axle out of the spline, then I could just pull that one out without having to disconnect any arms or anything like that. So 2 giant bolts is better than 12 bolts I have to cut. It's just easier that way if you're dropping the subframe. If you're just doing axles, probably just want to cut them or try your luck with an Allen wrench, whatever size they were. They almost always strip out. Someone had stated that they put 500 pounds of torque on there and it didn't move. That's ridiculous. So not really sure why they use those bolts. If you were to take them out, I'd probably switch them to like a hex bolt. So I disconnected those arms. I'm going to pull the axle out of here, and then I'm going to pull the whole diff out of there, and then I'm actually going to weld that diff myself. It'll be only the second diff I've welded, but the first one went really well, so I'll do it again to mine. Alright, so I've got the diff out of the subframe, and we're going to go ahead and tackle getting these bushings out first. So we have to torch these, make them really, really hot, melt the rubber all around them, knock this metal piece from inside out, and then we'll take a sawzall inside there. So I got one side done. Battery cut out on the GoPro, so you didn't get to see me burn out all of these. Basically, just took a chisel and chiseled it on 2 sides, and then hammered the metal and got it real hot all around. You can still melt out all of this if you want, but what you're doing here is you're taking a sawzall, which you'll see, and you're cutting this metal piece. It looks like it's part of the diff, but there's a whole nother sleeve that's inserted there you got to cut out, and you'll see. And this is the lip there. So what we're doing is we're going to sawzall that lip on 2 sides, and then that'll loosen it enough that you can chisel out that lip, and the whole thing should come right off. Okay. So you can see I went really deep on top here because this collar needs to be split, but I did not go too far. Okay, I did not cut into this part of the diff here because this is part of the diff, just this collar that's sitting on top. It's okay if you cut through a little bit, it's not a big deal. Same on the back side. If you cut through the back side here like I did, it's not a big deal. Your sleeve that goes in there is going to hold everything anyway, so that's all right. Obviously you want to minimize that as much as possible, but it's not going to make too much of a difference. So you can see how easily I hammered that collar out after I cut it, because it slipped inside of itself, made the hole smaller, and now it's got a clean area inside. We'll clean it up a little bit, but the actual new solid bushings. They slip in there just fine. This one's a little tight, but the other side's fine. So you just kind of tap that in. I'm not going to put it in all the way because I'm going to clean that, but that'll tap in just fine like that. It only goes in one way, so you don't have to worry about it. And then now we got to do the subframe, basically the same process. Alright, so we got one of these tough buggers out. Had to cut into this one a little more than I wanted to, but that's okay, it's clean inside, so. Take your time, it takes a while, they're a bitch. If you can get all the way through on one side, that's what you want. If you can get on through on two sides, it'll make your life a little easier, but cutting on this side was a pain. So, all the other ones, I've got the actual centerpiece out. I ended up just using a sawzall or a hacksaw instead of a torch, just because I've got it in a garage and an enclosed space and I didn't want to smoke myself out. So if you can get your subframe outside, it's probably the best bet. So now I'm gonna get all these other ones out. These are actually really clean inside, and they're painted because of the way that the bushings were manufactured, so that's nice. I am not gonna have to grind them down or clean them up or anything like that. The new bushings should just slide right in. So I have already kind of mocked up these two according to how the diff sits in there. Make sure you've got the one with 2 holes on the proper side. It sits on the left facing from the rear of the car. These aren't as tight as, say, an S13 or R32 or any of those Nissan subframes where you gotta freeze them and you gotta bang them in with a hammer and sit there. These quite literally just press in. So I'll just give them a tap with a hammer and they'll be good to go. I'm not gonna do that until I get the diff lined up, because those 2 holes, if you push them in canted a little bit, then it won't line up properly. So for the other guys, for the diff itself, you press in there like that, and then they've got another side here. Clink. And they just sit together, easy peasy. You can't put these in wrong. They only fit one way. And you got yourself some nice solid bushings that will give you better steering inputs, more response. Overall, the car will feel more rigid. These also have instructions QR code on there, which I thought was pretty neat. I think the instructions just kind of take you to the page. I tested it out and I couldn't get it to work because it looked like their website was down, but I eventually went to their website. They didn't really have step-by-step instructions. They just have pictures of the orientation of how it went, which is really all you need for this application. But you'll see the thicker ones with this taper are going to go underneath, like that. So the two that are tapered together go together. This one slips in on top. You can give it a little whack with a hammer. Squeeze right in. This guy goes underneath. Then your bolts will go through there. This one's a little loose, but it doesn't have any play. This one sits in there. The rest of these are in there nice and good. This one just sits right on top. It's a flat disc. And then this guy fits in there. It's the only one that fits in there. Got them all in there around. And this guy. So next, all we need to do is put everything back together.
Getting the subframe back into the car is no easy feat. Now, it's definitely easier if you have two people because you can lift it up from both sides. But I was by myself, so I just had to lift up the subframe and use the jack to get the diff positioned properly so I could bolt it in before it goes back in the car. It definitely helps to do this as opposed to putting the subframe in first and then the diff, because you have those 3 Allen head 12mm bolts in the front that are really hard to get to when it's in the car. I think you probably would have to bang up the trunk a little bit in order to get some tools to fit back there, and then torquing it down properly. Now, I did end up having to disconnect both sides of the knuckles from all the arms so that I could get the axle more freely in and out of the knuckles themselves. So here we're just putting all that back together and getting the diff lined up with the arms and the axles in place so I don't have to do it in the car. Much easier that way. Get everything assembled and just kind of loosely bolt it in, not necessarily torque down to spec or anything. So once I got all the arms put back together and everything was lined up properly, started putting the bolts for the actual diff in the differential through the subframe. Got the bushings lined up there and then put all the bolts through and tightened them down outside of the car. And then the ones on the other side as well, just kind of loosely put those in hand tight. Didn't torque them down yet, but enough that it's going to hold it in solidly in place. Next, you want to position it right under the car and then lower the car on top of it. If you're doing this with the jack under your car, you'll kind of have to play with moving the jack with the subframe. Definitely going to need a friend to help you out there. And then we just had to line everything up and get the actual rear end of the subframe to drop into the holes first, evenly on both sides if you can, otherwise it won't fit properly and it'll give you a hell of a time like it did for me.
So I was losing daylight in the last clip, and you really couldn't see much anyways. Once I got the subframe, or the car lowered onto the subframe, it's very limited view, and I couldn't hold a camera at the same time. So the trick to getting the subframe on from any position really is to make sure your rear holes are lined up. There's like little pegs coming off of the frame, and the subframe will line up in there. But don't tighten them down all the way, because you need to evenly get these to bolt in as well. It helps to have 2 jacks. If you have 1 jack on each side on the front, and then get these lined up, you can then use the jacks to keep this level, which just makes it a lot easier. Otherwise it pinches and it won't go up all the way. So recommended torque specs for the OEM subframe is really low. It's like, we looked it up and it was like something like 20 foot-pounds of torque. So I torqued these up to like 100 and something. Just German specs, good and tight. Do what feels right for you. Especially with solid subframe bushings, you want that to be tight. You don't want that coming loose. So the only thing after this step is to tighten everything back down, make sure everything is back in the right place. So put the coilovers back on. I haven't torqued those down yet. Make sure all your arms are connected, and then you reconnect your brakes, which I'm not going to do yet because we're about to do a dual caliber kit. And then you want to make sure that you put all these extra arms and everything back. Obviously, put your exhaust back on, which goes underneath there. So pretty simple step there. Go ahead and do that yourselves if you're following along. If this video helped you, please give it a like, subscribe, even share it if you think it'll help someone else. And you can stick around for the next video if you want to see the dual caliber installation from Serial 9, which I'm actually going to do right now. So you can click on the next video to see that. Thanks for watching. As always, keep it real.